In this three-part video series, I am presenting an overview of Islam's influence and intense contemporary relevance, and we consider the challenge it poses, the historical forces which have given rise to Islam as we know it today, its place within a religiously pluralistic society, the 5 pillars of Islam, and the 6 articles of faith. And each video ends with some biblical reflections. And in this video, the first of the series, we consider the challenge of Islam, historical forces, and its place in a religiously pluralistic society. In many parts of the West, Islam has been growing rapidly, and it's become either the second or third largest religion in many Western countries, for example, the US and the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Australia, and so on. And this has been largely a result of migration patterns, a comparatively high birth rate, and the fact that currently most of the world's refugees are Muslims fleeing from countries like Syria and Afghanistan and South Sudan and Somalia and Myanmar and places like that. This is a picture of a refugee camp in Pakistan. Islam presents a major alternative for those who seek an alternative spirituality or way of life. And the reasons are wide and varied. Prominent and respected personalities are an obvious draw card. I mean, in the US, of course, we've still got the legacy of the great boxer Muhammad Ali, which lives on. And then there's also the basketball great Shaquille O'Neal, and there's rapper Ice Cube, and there's the actor Will Smith, and many, many others. In the UK, there's the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. In Australia, there's TV host and academic Waleed Ali. And then again, some women become Muslims through marriage, and yet others find wholesomeness in a morality that they see as standing against the treatment of women as sex objects. Islam's stand against alcohol and drugs strikes a chord with some, and others reacting against the superficiality that characterises so much of Western civilization feel that Islam offers them a life of substance. And they hear Islam speaking with a definite voice and marking out clearly how a good person should live. And there's growing public sense that Christianity is irrelevant in the West and even morally compromised, and that adds to the relative appeal of Islam. Well, let's dive back into history. How did Islam kick off? Well, as a world religion, Islam dates back, of course, to the birth of Muhammad, who arrived on the scene about the year 570 AD. And from the age of 40 onwards, Muhammad claimed that Allah had sent the angel Gabriel to dictate revelations to him. Muslims insist that it is the collection of these revelations that now comprise the Islamic holy book, the Quran. Notably, Muhammad's father's name was Abd Allah, servant of Allah. So obviously Allah was around before Muhammad. Indeed, prior to Muhammad's birth, Al-Ilah, the god, was being worshipped along with more than 360 other gods at an established pilgrimage site in Mecca, which was then called the Kaaba, cube. So that again was already there before Muhammad came on the scene. And around 613 AD, that's when Muhammad began to declare that there was only one God and that he himself was God's final prophet. Fierce opposition from the inhabitants of Mecca forced him to flee with many of his converts, and they went to Medina, then called Yathrib, and that's the famous Hijrah, the departure from one's country, which marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. And Muhammad became a warlord who, around 630, eventually succeeded in conquering his hometown of Mecca, and Mecca then became the central Muslim sanctuary. Muhammad then undertook to subjugate all of Arabia to Islam. Muhammad died on June the 8th, 632 in Medina, and he had not communicated what should be done after his death, and there was bitter disagreement about who were entitled to be Muhammad's successors. There were those who believed that Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, should be his successor, should be the first caliph, as such leaders came to be called. And this is the beginning of the Muslim sect that we now know as Shia Islam. And it was only after the third caliph, Uthman, the one who incidentally authorised an official version of the Quran, after he was murdered, that Ali at last became caliph. But then Ali too was murdered, and to make matters worse, his son Muhammad's grandson Hussein, was also killed at the Battle of Karbala in the year 680. So certainly at this point, if not before, the cleavage between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam became unbridgeable. The martyrdom of Hussein is commemorated annually by millions of Shiites, and indeed every year tens of millions of Shiites visit the city of Karbala in central Iraq, which rivals the annual pilgrimage of Muslims to Mecca. In many countries, Sunnis and Shiites continue to fight and kill each other to this day. For a millennium, Islam's impressive expansion was largely due, though not exclusively, to military conquest. And during this period, the Muslim empire it reached its greatest extent around 732, which was the year when further Islamic expansion was thwarted after the Battle of Tours in modern-day France, when Charles Martel defeated Muslim invaders from Spain. The 9th century is significant because that was the period during which the so-called hadiths, or traditions about Muhammad's life, were collected and selected and published by the compilers we now know as Bukhari and Muslim. It was a massive body of material which is regarded as authoritative for most Muslims. Of course, the Muslim world has never forgotten the long, bloody and brutal period of the Crusades between roughly the years 1096 and 1271. And this, while it slowed the advance of Islam, it eventually resulted in defeat for Europeans and a Muslim victory resulted. And the mighty Ottoman Empire began its rise in 1281, and it ended up controlling much of Southeast Europe and Western Asia and North Africa between the 14th and the 20th centuries. But Islam was to suffer many major setbacks, and in the 16th century the Portuguese were involved in pushing back Islam through its conquest of Goa and their assistance in liberating Christian Ethiopia. 1683 is a major date which marks the defeat of the Ottomans in Vienna, followed by the liberation of Hungary and Transylvania. And the 18th century ended with Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. In the 19th century, Mughal rule in India was ended by British rule, and the continuing Russo-Turkish wars saw many defeats inflicted on the Ottomans, enabling Eastern European nations to become independent. World War I resulted in the final defeat and dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And indeed, in the period between the middle of the 18th century and the middle of the 20th century, most of the Muslim world came under Western colonial rule. Now that was a major setback, given that for centuries it had been the other way round. And rubbing salt into the wound was what happened in 1948. What happened then? The establishment of the modern state of Israel, in land that many Muslims considered to be theirs. Now there are a significant body of Muslims who are committed to reversing these setbacks and bringing about a world that is dominated by Islam. And the fall of the Twin Towers in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq by ISIS in 2014 should make this abundantly clear. Islamic revivalism is especially associated with such groups as the Wahhabi sect, which produced Osama bin Laden, the Deobandi movement of India and Pakistan, Jamaat-e-Islami, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Tablighi Jamaat, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS, Daesh, and we could go on and on. And revivalist Muslims, they diagnose that Islam's decline must be due to a failure to observe Islam properly. And so as they see it, the cure is to force greater compliance with the demands of Sharia, Islamic law. And one clear indication that this revivalist agenda has an immense impact on Muslims all around the globe is the increasing frequency with which Muslim women wear headscarves and burqas. The vast majority of Muslims are peaceable and they're not revivalist, but the actions of Muslim revivalists have all too often served to create an unfortunate stereotype of Muslims that is contrary to this. and many revivalists have been willing to resort to violence to achieve their ends. The 1979 Iranian Revolution was followed not by a glorious resurrection of Islam, but by corruption and savagery. The Taliban imposed unspeakable cruelties on the people of Afghanistan. ISIS has gained infamy through its videoed beheadings. Revivalist fervour has pitched Muslim against Muslim, and the great majority of the world's refugees are Muslims. Today, even as Islam gathers strength in many Western settings, there is a growing disenchantment with Islam in its own homelands, and significant numbers are embracing the Christian faith. Still, Islam is the second largest religion on earth with over 1.6 billion adherents. It continues to grow. It continues to attract and claim the allegiance of many. Let's think about Muslims in a pluralistic society, and here is a picture of Gallipoli Mosque in the suburb of Auburn in Sydney in Australia. So I might use Australia, since I live here, as an example of a society characterised by religious pluralism. I mean, what can we say about the place of Muslims in such a society? Well, there's a significant diversity among Australian Muslims. And yet, nevertheless, Professor Abdullah Saeed, the author of Islam in Australia, he recognises, firstly, that there is broad agreement among Australia's Muslims concerning core values and beliefs and ideas and institutions. Also, he notes that Sunnis and Shiites are much more unified in Australia than they would be in their home countries, and that a significant percentage, he calculates at about 30 to 40% of Australia's Muslims he describes as being what he calls committed Muslims. Now, many Muslims adapt well to Australian society and culture, and yet the strength of traditional mainstream Islam prevents significant numbers from appropriately integrating into Australian society. And sometimes Muslims have even succeeded in changing Australian society itself, so as to accommodate, for example, Islamic Sharia law requirements. And so the Muslim demand for halal food has led to the slaughter of animals in Australian abattoirs conforming to Sharia law. And then we find that there are separate prayer rooms for Muslims in such places as airports and some educational institutions. I mean, that's another example of this. There are unfortunate and unacceptable expressions of prejudice and discrimination against Muslims. Now, that's not helped, of course, when some Australian Muslims promote an Islamic way of life that involves radical cultural difference and values that clash with mainstream Australian and Christian values. And such instances have led some Christian leaders to voice warnings about the threats that they believe that Islam poses for the future well-being of Australia. So it's not a trouble-free ride. How do we respond to this when we're trying to look at this with a biblical kind of perspective? Well, the period of the Crusades was clearly a dreadful time, and there's considerable controversy concerning the rights and the wrongs of this conflict, and also regarding the apportionment of blame. But John Azuma, who is the director for the Centre of Islamic Studies at London School of Theology, he commends Joseph Cummings' pertinent remarks about the impact of the Crusades. Whatever we might think about some of the historical rights and wrongs and things like that. It used to be commonly said that Islam was Satan's greatest masterpiece, says Cummings. He says, I believe that's not true. Cummings says, I believe that Satan's greatest masterpiece was the Crusades. Why? Is it because the Crusades were the worst atrocity that ever happened in history? I think Hitler was worse, he says. Stalin was worse. Pol Pot was worse. What is so horrible about the Crusades is that it was done under the symbol of the cross. That Satan succeeded in distorting the very heart of the Christian faith. The cross is at the heart of the entire Christian faith. And for the Muslims and the Jews of the world, what does the symbol of the cross now signify? The cross now signifies Christians hate you enough to kill you. And what is the cross supposed to signify? It is supposed to signify God loved you enough to lay down his life for you, and I love you enough that I would lay down my life for you. So, Cummins continues, Satan succeeded in taking the very heart of the Christian faith and turning it around to mean not just something different, but to mean the exact opposite of what it was supposed to mean. The right response is not one of apologising about the Crusades, and for many Muslims this will be perceived as fawning and ending up being counterproductive. Christian humility is not weakness. But we do need to be speaking with Muslims as those who are consciously and conspicuously striving to live cross-shaped lives. Muslims come from a wide diversity of backgrounds, and it is imperative to avoid stereotypes. In his very helpful book, The Crescent Through the Eyes of the Cross, Nabil Jabour helpfully discriminates between three types of Muslims. So first of all, there are cultural Muslims. Now, cultural Muslims are those who adhere to social norms rather than to theology. In other words, they're born into Islam. And then again you've got what we might call Quranic Muslims. That's the second category, the Muslims who embrace the faith. They adhere to the explicit teaching of the Quran. And Quranic Muslims follow Islam closely, and they seek on a daily basis to apply the teachings of the Quran to their lives. And among these Quranic Muslims, some of them, not all, some of them are fundamentalists. And that brings us to the third category of Muslims, and that's the militant Muslims. Now, militant Muslims are those who actively engage in defending the Islamic faith, either by means of armed conflict or perhaps through, and maybe in addition to that, strategic efforts that are aimed at the destruction or the subjugation of non-Muslims who are understood to constitute a threat to the Islamic population in particular, or to Islamic civilization in general. Now, this group of militant Muslims includes the fanatics and some of the fundamentalists. Nabil Jabour asks us to look back to the beginning of the 20th century, and he suggests that at that time the Muslim world looked like this. Now, as you can see from this little diagram that Jabour has presented us with, at that time, the beginning of the 20th century, cultural Muslims were the most powerful group in the Muslim world. And Jabour observes that cultural Muslims at that time had a great impact on their countries as they promoted modernity and secular education. And at that time, militant Muslims played a minor role. And indeed, as the downward arrows indicate, many were settling for being Quranic Muslims, while many Quranic Muslims were adopting a more culture-informed rather than a Quran-shaped Islam. However, when we look at the state of play today, well, Jabour proposes that the situation looks more like this. You'll see that the triangle has been flipped. And now the downward arrows, they indicate a movement in the opposite direction. In the Muslim world as a whole, cultural Muslims no longer have the dominance that they had at the beginning of the 20th century. And today moderates and open-minded Muslims are in a much weaker situation, and their voices are often drowned out by fanatics. And the much smaller percentage of cultural Muslims are in the process of, in many cases, of becoming Quranic Muslims. And militants have been able to exploit the sometimes legitimate grievances of Muslim populations and to recruit support and volunteers to join their ranks. Now look at this other picture that Nabil Jabour presents to us. And what Nabil Jabour is trying to get across to us through this illustration is that we need to be aware that there's a huge war that is waging today in our world for the souls and the minds of Muslims, and so that either we draw the Muslims we know to open-mindedness and to Christ, or we can push them away to fanaticism. And this illustrates that when Christians are seeking to explain what they believe to Muslims, what particularly matters is not the cleverness of our explanations, but our disposition and our attitude. There was an extensive survey that was carried out by the Fuller Theological Seminary School of Intercultural Studies. And this indicated that the most telling perceived factor in causing Muslims to become Christians is seeing Christians living out their faith. Now, Muslims speak of belonging to a community that transcends national, ethnic and class divisions, which they call the Ummah, and which is most powerfully symbolised at the time of the Hajj to Mecca, where mode of dress and behaviour is the same for all Muslim pilgrims, regardless of their backgrounds. And Christians need to demonstrate that they too belong to a community that transcends national, ethnic and class divisions, but a community which also points to Jesus as one in whom at all times, as a community of, over which Jesus is the Lord, a community which expresses the love of Christ for each other. Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another."